Hi guys, and welcome to another video on my channel. And first and foremost, an apology. I've been away for, well, probably best part of a year since I actually managed to get a video out to you guys. A business venture stepped in place that I had to throw my heart and soul at. Still going on, so I'm not going to make any promises on how often I'm going to be able to get videos out there, but obviously if there's a product that I feel is worthy of a review, then I will throw it on the channel, and hopefully over the summer I can get a bit more kind of creative stuff going as well, because it is something that I do enjoy doing. So the more I can get out, the better from my own point of view. So what do we have in front of us here? Well, yes, it's another 3-axis handheld gimbal from Feiyu-Tech. GearBest actually got in touch with me, a large Chinese company, massive reseller over in China. They approach a lot of YouTube channels and offer products for review, so they can kind of do some promotion. I said to them, you know, if you're happy to, by all means send me a gimbal. They suggested the Vimble C because it was a moderately well priced gimbal. I hadn't had one yet. It's been out probably about a year, I think it's been out. So yeah, they sent that to me. I have to admit, it took about 2 months to get to me. And at the time when this was happening, I think it was priced at about £85 on their website. At the moment, the silver version is available for about £114, and the black version, the one that I've got here, is up at £160. So there does seem to be quite a large fluctuation in prices. The key with buying with GearBest is to obviously try and get the best price by just constantly having a look at it, and depending on whether or not you can get this particular gimbal at a reasonable price will really dictate as to whether or not I would recommend you buying one as well. Anyway, we'll get further into that. So what do you actually get in the box? Well, you get the gimbal, which is here, and if I just move this out of the way, you don't really get much more other than a couple of foam pads, which are these. These are designed to actually clip onto these areas of the gimbal. I'll show you that in a moment. And that's for action cameras. You get a USB-C charger, and you get a couple of instruction manuals, and that is literally all you get in the box. So there's nothing really too exciting about that. So let's just have a quick look at the construction of it. Basically, you get a very familiar feeling upper part, so the motor construction, all aluminium, very solid, very well built, typical of the previous SPG gimbals that Feiyu-Tech have done. Indeed, I have the SPG live here. You can see the similarities in terms of construction, same motors, same principles in that. The lower half is plastic. I have to admit, it feels a little bit cheap and tacky in terms of the plastic, but it does the job. Reasonable sort of pistol grip to it. It's quite a large grip, so if you've got very small hands you're going to struggle with that. But then you've got a few buttons on there. You have an on-off button here, which also serves as a shutter button. You've got a joystick, so that is a very low profile joystick slider that moves around. You've then got on the side a USB port for charging. Be able to see that there. There we go. And then on the back you've also got another switch, and this one is designed for the mode by pressing it. That's kind of a mode switch by pushing it in, but then you've got a slider left and right to provide you with zoom in and zoom out. So that's the basics of the actual gimbal. In terms of the construction at the top, they have actually made some nice changes here since the last product that I reviewed. So the SPG Live, which is here, in fact let me just move the Vimble out of the way. The SPG Live, this was a very similar product, designed again for mobile phone use. Same sprung construction, so you put your phone in there and it springs, but the problem that this one had was that when you wanted to balance your phone, you would grab your phone like so. You would put it in the spring clamp like so, and then the issue you've got, as you can see there, my phone does not balance at all in this, and the problem is with that is that you have a weighting system. So the only way that you could balance it is actually to add these weights on the sides. Now that was the heaviest weight that came, so I always had to actually move the center of gravity slightly by sort of sliding my phone along, so leaving a gap here, and that would then allow me to just about balance the phone. Really messy system because you had to have those weights. Obviously if you had different phones you'd have to keep moving it around. I was not a big fan of the way that they had created that, and to be honest they responded pretty quickly after they created the SPG Live, and they created the, I can't remember what it's called, it was another SPG product, but that had the same sort of system that this does, which has got a knurled aluminium nut right there, And then basically the way you do it is you loosen that nut up, and you can see there is a slider which allows you to move left and right depending on the weight of your phone. So if I were to mount my phone on this, all I do is I would grab my phone, pop it in there. You can see that's like that, and then basically I just have to slide that along, and once it's balanced, so I'm just going to pop it down now. That's clearly not balanced. Slide that a bit more, probably a bit more. A little bit more there. There we go. That's now feeling almost balanced there. Maybe a tiny little notch, and then all you do is you just tighten that up, and boom, your phone's balanced. Now it's crucial on these 3-axis gimbals that you have a well balanced device in it, because while these motors can cope with kind of holding a phone and its weight, if you don't have it in balance, then what you're going to find is these motors aren't doing what they're supposed to. They're purely designed to compensate for movement. They're not designed to be physically holding and moving around your phone. So if you've got it out of balance, then it's going to start glitching out, the horizon's going to be off, and the whole experience, the whole kind of smoothness of your footage is going to be affected by that. So critical to get a well balanced phone. I've got an iPhone 7 in this rather ugly bright eye blast on armoured case, but it proves that you can have a decent sized phone. I think the Plus phones will fit in there, absolutely no problem whatsoever. Now the only disadvantage with having a very large phone is that you do sort of find yourself somewhat limited in the portrait mode, the selfie mode as they call it, because you can't swing this bottom arm. You can see it's now colliding with that. You can't swing that round, and that means that you can't actually use it in a sort of a portrait mode like that. I'll show you how that works. It can still be done, you just have to have it upside down basically. So with that all said, now we've seen the construction of it, let's get into some of the features and let's just turn it on and see how it all works. Okay, so to turn the device on, very simple, you just turn the power on, hold that. May be difficult to see, but there's a couple of status LEDs left and right of the bottom motor there which tell you whether it's on or off, and as you can see it now initializes, and if I now move it around you can see we're in a horizon mode. Let's just make it a little bit easier by just going into the standard camera app. There we go. So that's the standard camera app, and you can see it's locked the horizon. So mode 1, you lock the horizon. Mode 2 is the mode where you can kind of look down and look at your feet. The way I tend to explain it is, let's say you were standing on top of a bridge and you wanted to look over the side and you wanted to film what's down below you. Obviously if you're on mode 1, you walk to the side of the bridge, you tilt this, and the phone doesn't actually look down. What you need to do is you then use the button on the back here. So you single tap 1, and then that puts it into mode 2. So now we walk up to the edge of the bridge, do this, and oh, hasn't actually clicked in. There we go. And now you can look down, and also of course you can look up. And that is mode 2. Very simple like that. The only other kind of real mode in terms of the actual kind of left and right and up and down is the lock mode. So let's say I wanted to lock it on this box here. What I would do is I would hold my finger now on the mode button on the back of the pistol grip. So I'm holding that, and now you can see it's remembered where I was looking and it's completely locked. So you've got a nice stable image there. Obviously not to the extremes that I'm wiggling this around, but it will lock in place. So if you point it at a space or a place in space, as it were, and then you hold that, then it will stay in a locked mode. So they're the 3 kind of basics. Now the only other one that I will show you is this selfie mode. So to activate that, what you do is you tilt over 30 degrees and then you single tap on that mode button on the back. And then as you can see, we now tilt down. Now again, because of the fact that I have got a phone that can't do the opposite direction, you would be able to do it so the motor sits at the bottom, but this is absolutely fine. I think, to be honest, this is probably a more stable way of doing it. So you do have a kind of a portrait mode that has full stabilization, and should you wish to get back, what you do is you just go back to 30 degrees like that, single press again, and bump, the gimbal returns itself back to where it was before in mode 1. So they are very much the basics. Now you can use that as I am right here. This is just the standard Apple iPhone app, so your phone's default camera. You can do that and it all works, no problem whatsoever. and you can get some nice stable footage. And there are some perks to using the actual phones built in compared to the FeiyuTech app. But what we'll do now is we'll load into the Feiyu-On application and we'll see what features that has. Okay, so let's go into the Feiyu-On app. Now this uses Bluetooth, of course, so all you need to do is select the gimbal. So we've got Vimble selected. We'll click on connect. That should show us the device. Found the device, choose the device, and there we go, we've gone into the app. So now we can see whether it's connected or not. So I'm now using the slider on the back for zoom in and zoom out. We're in video mode, it defaults to video mode as standard, but that's basically the it's just a third-party application. Now looking at some of the features, top left hand corner is the kind of back button. If we click on that, that will take us back to the menu where you can choose your gimbal. Underneath that we have got the, let me tap that, there we go, we've got the feature for exposure, white balance and ISO. It sort of kind of does it automatically for itself, but you can manually set it. If we were to tap on this button here, we will do the reverse camera. There we go, you get a nice shot of my camera. So that's the front facing camera. The one below that is face tracking. I'll demonstrate that later on in this video. Basically face tracking, all it does is it does kind of it uses facial recognition, so it's not going to be a case of you can highlight an object and follow it. It has to be a face. If you've got heavy clothing over your face, so if you've got dark glasses on, a hat, maybe a mask, something like that, then it may struggle with that because it's just looking for kind of the skin tones of a face, eyes, etc., and it tries to follow that, and it will make the using the Bluetooth, it will make the motors move around. Again, much better to just demonstrate that, so I'll do that later. But it's not to be confused with something like DJI's motion tracking, whereby you can actually draw a shape around an object and say, right, put that into your memory and try and follow that shape as it's moving around on screen, which is a little bit more clever than that. And unfortunately Feiyu-Tech, they do have a slightly, I don't know, their software is always somewhat lacking compared to the competitors like DJI, but you know, they are a smaller company, so that's understanding. And to its credit, face tracking does work in, you know, in many respects, in some ways, pretty well. Below that then we've got the settings button. So if we go into that, we've got settings for the video settings and the camera settings. We'll just fly through those very quickly so you can see them. Video settings, you can set your resolutions, your frame rates, and your camera settings, which is only to say have a grid or a watermark on it. Resolution is quite important because when you're using the Feiyu-On app, you can only film at 1920 by 1080 at 60 frames a second maximum. The reason that's important is if, like me, you're using an iPhone 7, for example, you can film using the native Apple app at 4K 30 frames per second. But if you're filming through the FeiyuTech app, you are reduced to 1080 at an absolute maximum at 60 frames a second. The other thing you can't do is you can't do the super slow motion. So with the iPhone, for example, you can go down, I think, to 720p and you can film at like 120 frames a second for super slow motion. On this app, you are limited to either 30 or 60 frames a second. So just bear that in mind. And again, if you want to get 4K footage that's stabilized, no problem. You just use the app that comes with the phone and you just put it in your gimbal. You can still connect it, you can still move it around. The stabilization will work. You just won't have necessarily all of the tie-ins with the Bluetooth functionality that you do from using the Feiyu-On application. So the only other thing to look at then is the gimbal setting. Now within the motor dynamics, you can choose kind of the aggression of the motors. You can do some tweaking in there. I'm not going to fiddle about too much with it. Generally speaking, out of the box, it seems to work absolutely fine. Follow settings, if we just go into that, what this does is it gives you the ability to speed up the motors. So if you're going to be standing in front of the phone and you're going to be moving around quite a lot, you're going to need to be able to add speed to the follow settings. You're going to make your motors react much quicker. If obviously you're going to be moving around very slowly, you're not going to want to do that. So that's one option that you've got there. Joystick settings, very similar. The joystick on the front, you can choose how fast it reacts. So if you want it to do really nice slow moving things, then you put it on the slower setting. If you want it to go really fast, you choose fast, and it does that for both axes. So that's up and down, pan and tilt. Restore default settings obviously says exactly what it is, and query update, that means that you can update the firmware of the gimbal through the app, which is always very nice because it means you don't have to have proprietary software that you have to put on your computer. Feiyu-Tech historically have never supported Macs, so that's always been a pain to get firmware updates. So it's always nice to see that you can do the firmware update through the application. So let's just go out of that, and then on the right hand side, that covers all the things on the left. The right hand side will just go from the top right hand corner. That is the shutter button, so if I tap on that, boom, it takes a photograph, exactly the same as pressing the button once here. So if I tap that, that takes a photograph. Video, likewise, if you press the big red button, that will start video recording. Press it again, that will stop it. To do that using the shutter button, you have to hold it down. So you hold it for about 1.5 seconds. There we go, and we've started a video. Hold it for 1.5 seconds again, and it stops. Nice and simple, and again, that's just using the Bluetooth functionality. Underneath the red button, we have various chromas, so you can put a black and white tone to it. You can choose your various tones of the video, or you can have nothing whatsoever. I prefer auto personally. And then underneath that, I'm not going to press that, but that goes into your album. Literally just asks for access to your photo album, and then you can look and review all of the footage that you've taken on the app. Just to the left of this, a little bit hard to see on this here. Let me just move that. There we go. We've then got the various settings. So it defaults, as I say, it will default to video, but we've also got time-lapse setting. We've got a panoramic setting, so you can take panoramas. Panoramas on the SPG Live, I have to admit, were not very good. You can take the photos, but the stitching software that it used was really not very good. You could see very, very obvious lines. So that would be something that we're going to have a play around with a little bit later on. Video, again, that's just the default mode. Photo, that's just the default photo mode. And there's night vision, which is now going to, yes, completely blind everything, because all it does is it whacks the exposure up beyond the realms of what anyone would ever be able to do. But again, we can potentially test that out, see what it's like in low light. So that is literally the basic settings of the Feiyu application. It's not too bad. It's improved a lot since the days of the SPG Live, but I have to admit I've had lots of problems with connections. Sometimes the app will just completely crash for no reason, especially in the middle of a time lapse or something like that, which is very frustrating. And also I had it at one point where it literally just would not connect via Bluetooth, and when it did connect, it just came up with a black screen. So there are glitches, there are niggles. I had to reset the iPhone to do it. It may have been the iPhone that was the problem, but you know, like I say, it's something that I did notice, and I think it's worthy of mentioning. The only other things that I wanted to talk about whilst we've got this on the bench then was just obviously the joystick. So joystick works exactly like you'd think. Up for down, down for up. That's my setting. You can reverse that yourself. Left pans to the left, right pans to the right, and as we saw, we can obviously do a combination of that, so you can move it around. It's all very responsive, and again, depending on the aggression that you've set up in the settings, will give you the smoothness that you want. Now, the only other thing, we've looked at the zoom on the back, so that zooms in and that zooms out. The only other thing that's worth mentioning that's kind of a niggly little thing for me is that to turn the gimbal off, what you have to do is you have to hold down the shutter button. Now the problem with doing that, as we're going to demonstrate here, is I'm now going to push and hold, and that's now turning off, but as you can see, it's also filming. So while that's died, the gimbal's now off. If we now look, we can see the application is still actually in a movie. Now that's not ideal, because if that is recording and it's given me a error there, so if that is actually recording a video, then potentially that could sit there recording a video and use all the space on your iPhone. So it's something to just bear in mind. If you are in the application, then you do turn it off, it will probably continue a video film at the time. So just be aware. It's a niggly little thing that I'm sure could be fixed with just a software update, but worth mentioning, I think, in that respect. So that's the Feiyu app. Now what we'll do is we'll get out on the road, we'll do some filming whilst on a bike, see what it's like in terms of actual stabilizing. The camera obviously is going to be the iPhone, so we're not reviewing the footage per se, but just to see how it holds its horizon, and we'll talk a bit about that, and then after that we'll lead to some conclusions about the Vimble. So out onto the open road we go. Now this is my usual fairly boring route that I always ride for gimbal reviews, but at least that means that you can compare it to other videos, other products that I've done before, so you can see if there's any major differences. Now naturally the quality of the camera, as I've said before, that's not really in comparison at the moment. This is just the iPhone 7. I'm actually running this in 1080 at 30 frames a second, so fairly standard from that point of view. Yes, it can do a higher resolution, but this is kind of a more general setting that I think most people use out of the box. So we're not really looking at the quality of that. What we are looking at is the stabilisation, how well it copes with the horizon shift. Horizon roll, especially, and horizon drift is one of the major problems with gimbals. So what you're looking for there is you look at the level of the horizon, and you make sure that when you're sort of panning left and right or moving around, that you don't find that the horizon slopes left or right. If it does slope and it slowly sort of only just regains a horizon, then the gimbal's not doing its job in the way that it should do. And again, it's very important to make sure that you have your gimbal as balanced as possible to prevent that from happening. Now, one thing that should be mentioned, because this is of course a mobile phone gimbal, it does mean that if you're doing anything like this, like riding on a bike, or if you're, say, snowboarding, doing things where you're moving quite quickly, the issue that you've got is you've got a very large flat face of a phone which is acting as a sail. Now, not only does that mean that you're naturally going to have a lot of wind noise, to the point where I haven't even bothered putting the audio beyond about 1 or 2 decibels on this video because it is just pure wind noise, but the other issue is that acting as a sail will actually push the phone around, and it will mean that the phone will potentially push against the motors, and if it pushes against the motors can glitch out and you'll find it stutters and stops. The day that I was filming, the wind wasn't too bad. I did try filming in much higher winds, I think about 20-mile-an-hour winds, and when on my bike it literally would glitch the motors out probably every 2 or 3 minutes when a big blast came. So it is worth bearing that in mind. Obviously, if you're using something like one of the G5s, one of the action camera GoPro Hero based gimbals, they're much less susceptible to that problem because they're a much smaller kind of surface area for the wind to push against. The other thing to notice, of course, is, I'm going through the various modes. You saw a moment ago that I panned down. I'm in mode 2 at the moment, so I'm now panning up. Just kind of testing them all out. Now, you can also see there's quite a lot of bumpiness. Now, there are a couple of factors with that. With a 3-axis stabilizing gimbal, the one thing that it doesn't do is it doesn't compensate for up and down. Now that means on a bumpy old road like this with a bike that actually doesn't have too much suspension on it at all, that means that you're going to be able to notice that. So the shake of your hand is always going to be noticeable. I have to admit, I found this video to be more shaky than some of the other videos that I've taken in similar conditions, using the same bike, using the same road. For some reason, not sure what it is, this gimbal just seems to be a little bit more sensitive in terms of that up and down bounce motion. So certainly something that you should consider in that respect. It does get much less dramatic when you're actually walking, and you can do an element of compensation just using your wrist to kind of bounce the you reverse bounce the bounce of your body out from it. But as you can see, there's a certain harshness to the rough bumps of the road here, which are translating through the bike, through the body, through the arm, and into the gimbal. And it doesn't cope too well with reducing that. So definitely the Vimble, I don't think it's something that you would use if you were doing sports riding, if you were as I say, doing snowboarding, skateboarding, things like that. I think if you're going to do something like that, you should probably be using an action camera based gimbal, which tend to be a little bit more versatile. And of course the other fact that an action camera, generally speaking, is a lot lighter than a phone, which means there's much less compensation needed by the motors. If you're wobbling from side to side on a very large wide phone, then there's forces acting on the extremes of the left and the right of the phone, which mean the motor has to work harder to try and keep it level. So anyway, now we can see that we're just doing the walk. Again, there's a bit of a bounce to it, but it's much less pronounced than it was when on the bike. And again, I'm not trying to compensate this. I'm holding it completely upright. I'm not trying to compensate that bounce out. I wanted it to show, everything that you've got. But what you can do is you can tilt your wrist forward, and you can actually hold it and kind of work your wrist whilst you're moving to counteract that. I still do think that the Vimble is showing a certain amount of harshness in the bounce there, more uncomfortable than I would like it to be, certainly, and certainly not as good as something like the DJI products in terms of being able to compensate that bouncing motion out. So now let's take a look at the panoramic setting, and unfortunately this is a massive failure. I think it's software related, but the application just refused to let it happen for me. You can see this is kind of an iPhone screenshot that I'm taking, so you can see the process that it uses. What it does is you get it to the point where you want to take the first photograph, you then hit the shutter button. It then will proceed to tell you to kind of pan along using the joystick, is what I've done here on a tripod, and then when it gets to certain stages it will snap the photographs for itself and it should stitch together. This is the problem that I kept facing, is that I would do that, it would tell me the lighting conditions were poor. Granted, it's a little bit dark, but it's still reasonably acceptable out there. I'm in daylight, a slightly diffused daylight, which is normally very good for photography. So again, I try another attempt here. So it takes that first photograph, I use the joystick on the tripod again to actually pan around. It gets to the second marker, takes a snap. You can see on the preview, looks pretty good. The the stitching together there is not too bad. Continue to slowly pan around. It looks for another photo. Click. You can see there's a bit of a line between that one on the preview. Fair enough, I can accept that. It's not great, but it's working. Moves on to the next one and the final one. Click, takes another one and goes to generate panorama, and then thinks about it, and then snap, it will come back out into the camera mode, so you're just kind of continuing to use the gimbal. Now the problem is, at this point I go into my photo collection expecting to see a generated panorama. Nothing there whatsoever. Can't find it. It just doesn't put it in the photo collection. So a real downside on this. Again, unfortunately, this is just a prime example of the inbuilt app that FeiyuTech have given you being a little bit unreliable. What I will do is show you what you can potentially do with it. So this panorama here, this was taken putting the camera into, the gimbal into portrait mode, and then using the Apple inbuilt app and the panorama there. So of course I'm slightly zoomed out on here because with the Apple, unlike the FeiyuTech one, the Apple one takes it only in portrait mode. You can't do a landscape panorama, but the result that you get is very good. And actually, if you zoom in on that, you can see there's no stitching problems, anything like that. And using a gimbal for a panorama is actually going to work quite well. So while the panorama mode doesn't work on the Feiyu app at all, as far as I can tell, it can work for you using the FeiyuTech Vimble. It's just frustrating that it doesn't work on the software itself. Possible that it's an iOS 11 issue. It certainly might be just an iOS issue. Unfortunately, I don't have access to an Android to be able to test the Feiyu app with the gimbal, and it may simply be that FeiyuTech at some point in the future soon will come up with an update that resolves this issue and it just goes away. It's certainly software related, so fingers crossed they'll sort it in the future. Moving on to face tracking then, and this was a lot more successful than the panorama mode. As you can see, what I've done is I've mounted it on a tripod. This is again the iPhone screen capture, so you can see what it's doing. Naturally, the video that you actually record wouldn't have that red box rolling all over it, but what it shows you is how it acts, how it reacts to my face. I'm trying to trick it a little bit by having a hat and glasses on as well, whilst moving around at different ranges from the camera to see whether or not it will lose me. You'll see in a moment when I actually cover my mouth over, that's where it will actually get fooled. So it loses those facial features and it can't see my face anymore. Uncover the mouth, no problem whatsoever. And all in all, it does a pretty good job with it. It is a fairly slow track. I've got the motors set to 100%, which means that they should be as quick as possible to follow me. But even when I walk at a steady pace, it still struggles a little bit to keep up with me. So if you were going to use this, it would be fine, if you're sitting in a fairly fixed scenario, but you were going to move left and right, doing a podcast, a blog or something like that. But you wouldn't want to be doing it if you're going to be moving fast across a screen. The other thing that you'll notice when I move backwards slightly is that the tracking goes away probably about 4 or 5 feet away from the camera, at which point it will then actually lose those facial features. I think that's going to be very much dependent on the lighting conditions. It is a bit of a dull, murky day today. I think in bright sunshine it probably would be okay, but again, the reflection that comes onto your face will dictate whether or not your features can be seen by the camera. All in all though, I have to admit it's pretty decent. I think it's certainly something that could be used in certain scenarios. Maybe not as good as the DJI version, but pretty good all round. So let's conclude now on the Feiyu-Tech Vimble C. Is it a great product? No. Is it a terrible product? No. It's kind of middle ground, and it really comes down to how much you're able to get one for as to whether or not you're getting value for money. I think if you get one, if you buy one, regardless of the cost, you're not going to be disappointed necessarily with it. It does decent tracking, the stabilisation's pretty reasonable, the horizon lock seems to be good. The features, they're fairly basic, but they work. Face tracking can be used, time-lapse, nothing to write home about. You can't do motion tracking or anything like that on time-lapse. But the general app in terms of usefulness really comes down to that face tracking. Beyond that, I would just recommend that you use the normal phone app to get the best out of the product. In terms of build quality, seems to be absolutely fine. Battery life, I've been using it on a single charge for at least 3 or 4 hours now, and I haven't had any problems. I think the major problem that this gimbal has is pure and simple the competition from the likes of DJI, especially now they've come out with the Osmo Mobile 2. At £120, you get much better stabilization, you get a much better application, you get much better features within that application, and to date so far certainly the DJI Osmo Mobile 1, which I own, is by far and away the best for stabilization when using a mobile phone. Now again, that kind of sullies the name of the Vimble C, but if you can get one at a reasonable price, I still don't think you're going to be disappointed with it. My advice to you is keep checking on GearBest. They do seem to fluctuate in prices. At the time they sent me this one, I think it was on there for about £80. Currently the cheapest is about £114 if you get the silver version. The black one for no known reason is £160, which I would avoid at all costs at that kind of price. But if you can get it around the £80 to £100 mark and you're willing to wait a little bit of time for delivery, I really don't think you're going to be disappointed with the product. So guys, thanks for watching. Hopefully this video has been helpful. If you are interested in buying this gimbal, then please check the GearBest link below. Thanks to GearBest for supplying this one, and fingers crossed the next video will be a lot sooner than 1 year's time. See you on the next one.